paper is brown with age and gilt. Bundesarchiv, Berlin, File 12847V, Classification Level 18. Unsealed only in 1993. Inside, 5 pages of cramped Gothic script, each word carved deep enough to tear through the paper as if the writer was stabbing confessions into history itself. At the top, a date that burns like acid. November 15, 1943. Below it, a sentence that shatters everything we thought we knew about ordinary evil. We laughed when the old begged for mercy. Now I write with shame my final words. These are the last words of Feldwebel Otto Hauptmann, 7th Infantry Division, Army Group Center. Written in a bombed church in Belarus, hours before he stepped into falling snow and never returned. Found hidden beneath floorboards by Father Dmitry Kozlov, who carried this confession through 47 years of nightmares before finally surrendering it to history. This is his testimony. This is his damnation. This is his final attempt to transform laughter into shame, cruelty into confession, silence into the only honest sound a murderer can make. Don't let these forbidden voices be forgotten. Subscribe now so we can bring more hidden confessions to light. Otto Wilhelm Hauptmann was born April 2, 1918, in the village of Rothenburg ob der Tauber, Bavaria. His father, Wilhelm, had been a blacksmith before the Great War, a man who could forge horseshoes that lasted decades and church bells that called faithful to prayer for generations. His mother, Bertha, organized charity drives for the poor and sang in the church choir with a voice so pure that angels themselves seemed to pause and listen. Otto was the second of 4 children, the boy who helped his father shape hot metal and his mother distribute food to families whose harvests had failed. His hands were always busy, sketching horses in the margins of schoolbooks, learning to play his grandfather's accordion, carving wooden toys for children whose parents could not afford store-bought gifts. The villagers called him Gentle Otto, Kind Otto, the boy who would grow up to heal rather than harm. We laughed. Otto wrote in his confession, the words surrounded by dark stains that could have been tears or wine or blood. When they fell to their knees in the mud, when they raised their shaking hands toward heaven, when they whispered prayers in languages we did not understand. We laughed as if their desperation was entertainment designed for our amusement. The war came to Rothenburg gradually, then suddenly. First the parades, the speeches, the transformation of young men into instruments of national destiny. Otto was 21 when he was drafted, old enough to understand what service meant but young enough to believe the promises about quick victory and glorious return. He trained at Bad Kissingen for 6 months, learned to march in formation, handle weapons with precision, follow orders without hesitation or thought. The instructors emphasized unit cohesion above all else. Soldiers who laughed together, fought together, survived together. Laughter became currency, cruelty became camaraderie, shared participation in atrocity became the strongest bond of all. They begged for mercy, Otto wrote, returning again and again to the image that had poisoned his sleep for months. Old men whose crime was existing in villages we needed to pacify. Old women whose guilt was being related to partisans we could not catch. They begged in German, in Russian, in Polish, in languages that had no words for what we were about to do to them. Otto's unit was assigned to Army Group Center's advance into the Soviet Union, tasked with eliminating resistance in occupied territories. The orders were clear: treat civilian populations as potential threats, use any means necessary to maintain security, show no mercy to anyone who might aid enemy forces. What the orders did not specify was that any means necessary included public executions designed as entertainment, that maintaining security meant terrorizing entire villages into submission, that showing no mercy would transform ordinary German boys into laughing witnesses to mass murder. Otto's first atrocity occurred on September 23, 1942, in a village called Krasnoye, 40 kilometers east of Smolensk. Intelligence reported that local civilians were providing food and shelter to Soviet partisans. The village had to be punished, made an example, taught that collaboration with enemies would bring consequences worse than death. "Forgive me, Mother," Otto wrote, addressing words to a woman who had raised him to be kind. who would spend the rest of her life believing her son had died heroically defending the fatherland. Forgive me for forgetting everything you taught me about compassion, for learning to find humor in suffering, for becoming the kind of person who laughs at prayers. The operation began at dawn. Otto's company surrounded Krasnoy, rounded up all civilians over the age of 60, herded them into the village square for questioning about partisan activities. 17 men and women, the eldest 83 years old, the youngest 61. Grandparents and great-grandparents whose only crime was surviving long enough to witness their world's destruction. The interrogation was theater. Everyone knew the civilians would be executed regardless of what they said or didn't say. The questioning was designed not to gather intelligence but to provide justification for predetermined murder, to transform victims into conspirators, innocence into guilt. I was silent, Otto confessed, describing his role in the morning's entertainment. When Feldwebel Müller asked who wanted to make the old people dance, when he suggested we could make them hop like rabbits before shooting them, when he offered extra rations to whoever could make them beg most desperately. I was silent because silence felt safer than objection. But silence was complicity. Watching was participation. Standing aside while others committed atrocity was its own form of evil, perhaps worse than active cruelty because it required the conscious choice to abdicate moral responsibility while maintaining the illusion of innocence. The game began with simple commands. Kneel, stand, turn in circles, hop on one foot. The elderly civilians obeyed, hoping compliance might save their lives, not understanding that their obedience was precisely what made their torment entertaining for soldiers who had forgotten what it meant to see other human beings as anything more than objects to be manipulated. This is my last letter, Otto wrote, acknowledging that some confessions can only be made by men who have already chosen death over continued living with unbearable memory. I write it not for forgiveness but for testimony. Someone must know what we did in Krasnoy. Someone must remember the names of people who died for our amusement. The laughter started when 80-year-old Pavel Ivanov collapsed while attempting to hop in a circle. His ancient legs simply gave out, depositing him face-first in October mud while soldiers who could have been his grandsons howled with delight at his failure to perform tricks designed for trained animals. Grandmother Katia Volkova was forced to sing Russian folk songs while balancing on one foot. When she fell, the soldiers made her start over. When she fell again, they made her sing louder. When she fell a third time, they shot her in the leg and told her to keep singing while bleeding into the dirt. Dmitry Petrov, 73 years old, was ordered to crawl around the square barking like a dog. When he refused, claiming his dignity as a human being, the soldiers beat him with rifle butts until he barked. Then they made him beg for food scraps while crawling. Then they laughed at his humiliation until their sides hurt. The shame burns, Otto wrote, describing the acid that had eaten through his conscience for 14 months. Burns like fire in my chest, burns like poison in my throat, burns like the shame of remembering that I found their suffering funny. That for 20 minutes, I forgot these were human beings and saw them only as entertainment. But what Otto could not write, even in his final confession, was the deepest truth about that morning in Krasnoy, that the laughter had been genuine. Not forced, not performed for the benefit of comrades, not manufactured to demonstrate loyalty to the unit. The laughter had been real, spontaneous, authentic response to the sight of old people suffering for the amusement of young men who had been taught that cruelty was funny when directed at subhuman enemies. The psychological mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. Dehumanize the victims through propaganda that portrayed them as dangerous threats to German survival. Create group pressure that made participation feel mandatory and abstention feel like betrayal. Transform murder into game, atrocity into entertainment, mass killing into shared bonding experience. The execution phase began when the soldiers grew bored with their games. 17 elderly civilians were lined up against the village church, forced to face the building where they had worshipped for decades, told to pray one final time to a god who apparently approved of their imminent murder. I see their faces at night, Otto confessed, describing the ghostly procession that visited his dreams whenever exhaustion finally allowed him to sleep. Pavel crawling in the mud, Katia singing with blood running down her leg, Dmitri barking like the dog we turned him into. They visit me every night and ask the same question. Why did you laugh at our pain? The machine gun fire lasted 37 seconds. Otto counted every one, timed the duration of 17 deaths, measured the exact length of time required to transform living grandparents into bleeding corpses. 37 seconds of bullets. For hours of games. An eternity of memory that would poison every moment of Otto's remaining life. The bodies were left in the square as a warning to other villages. Let word spread that this was the price of collaboration, that German patience had limits, that resistance would be met with consequences designed to break the will of entire populations. The dead became messages, their corpses transformed into propaganda more effective than any poster or radio broadcast. But the psychological impact was not limited to Soviet civilians. The German soldiers who participated in the massacre carried their own form of infection, a moral wound that festered beneath the surface of military discipline and unit cohesion. Otto had learned to laugh at suffering, but he had also learned to hate himself for finding suffering funny. Support this work so the truth continues to reach people. Otto tried to rebuild his conscience in the months following Krasnoy. He wrote letters home that mentioned nothing about elderly civilians or entertainment executions, that spoke only of military operations against armed resistance fighters. He attended church services when possible, confessed to priests who could not understand the magnitude of what he had witnessed and participated in. But confession requires specificity, and Otto could not bring himself to describe what had actually happened in that village square. How could he tell Father Müller that he had laughed at old people's suffering? How could he explain to his mother that her gentle son had found amusement in forced degradation and public murder? The weight of unspoken truth corroded Otto's ability to connect with anyone who had not shared his experience. He became isolated within his own unit, unable to participate in the casual conversations that helped other soldiers maintain their sanity. Every joke reminded him of laughter that should never have existed. Every moment of levity felt like betrayal of the 17 people who had died for his entertainment. We were monsters, Otto wrote in the starkest assessment of his confession. Not born monsters, not bred for cruelty, not selected for evil. We were ordinary young men who learned to find humor in suffering because humor made suffering bearable for us. We laughed to avoid feeling. We laughed to avoid thinking. We laughed to avoid remembering that we were destroying human beings who deserved mercy rather than mockery. Otto's confession reveals details about Wehrmacht anti-partisan operations that remained classified for 50 years after the war's end. The systematic use of public humiliation as psychological warfare. The deliberate transformation of executions into entertainment designed to boost troop morale. The careful documentation of civilian deaths in reports that reduced mass murder to statistical abstractions. But the confession's most devastating passages are personal. Otto's recognition that evil is not something that happens to people but something people choose, moment by moment, laugh by laugh, silence by silence. His acknowledgement that ordinary human beings are capable of extraordinary cruelty when systems provide permission and peer pressure provides motivation. I laughed because everyone else was laughing, Otto wrote, dissecting the group psychology that had transformed him from village blacksmith's son into witness to atrocity. Because joining the laughter felt safer than standing apart. Because finding the suffering funny made it bearable to watch. Because if I could laugh, I could pretend I was not responsible for what was happening. The confession spans 5 pages but focuses obsessively on those 4 hours in Krasnoy, returning again and again to specific moments that had branded themselves into Otto's memory. Pavel's fall, Katya's song, Dmitri's barking, the sound of machine gun fire, the silence that followed, the laughter that had preceded everything. Each detail is preserved with photographer's precision, recorded by a mind that had apparently decided to memorize its own moral destruction. Otto had become the historian of his own evil, the archivist of his own shame, the curator of memories that made continued living unbearable. They haunt me not with anger but with sadness, Otto wrote, describing the nightly visitations that transformed sleep into punishment. They do not curse me for laughing at their pain. They weep for me because I laughed at their pain. They mourn not just for their own deaths but for the death of whatever had been good in me before I learned that cruelty could be funny. Otto's unit continued operations in Belarus through the winter of 1942-43, burning villages, executing civilians, implementing policies designed to turn occupied territory into wasteland that could not support resistance activities. Otto participated in everything, followed all orders, maintained the facade of good soldiering while his conscience died inch by inch. But he never laughed again. Not at anything. Not even at jokes that had nothing to do with war or death or suffering. The capacity for genuine humor had been poisoned by association with cruelty, contaminated by memory of laughter that should never have existed. By autumn 1943, Otto had stopped sleeping entirely. The nightly visits from Krasnoy's dead had become unbearable, their silent accusation more painful than any punishment a military court could have devised. Otto began volunteering for the most dangerous missions, hoping enemy bullets might provide the mercy he could not give himself. But death refused him. Every patrol returned safely. Every battle ended with Otto still breathing while other soldiers died around him. It was as if fate had decided that his punishment would be survival, that his sentence would be living with memory of laughter that echoed in his head like a broken record playing the same horrible song. The final entry in Otto's confession was written on November 15, 1943, in the bombed church of a village whose name he never recorded. Soviet forces were advancing, German positions were collapsing. The war that had transformed him into a monster was finally consuming its own creators. "I go now to find the 17 I helped murder," Otto concluded, setting down his pen for the final time. "I do not expect forgiveness from them or from God or from myself. I expect only silence, the kind of silence that should have filled my throat when my comrades began their games. The silence that might have saved 17 lives if I had been brave enough to choose conscience over camaraderie." Otto Hauptmann disappeared on November 16, 1943, during a Soviet artillery barrage that reduced his position to rubble and scattered body parts. His remains were never identified, his death never officially confirmed. He simply vanished into the chaos of a collapsing front, leaving behind only his confession and the weight of 17 deaths that had been transformed into entertainment. Father Dmitry Kozlov found Otto's letter while searching the ruined church for anything that might be salvaged for religious services. The priest read the confession by candlelight, understood its implications, faced the same choice that had confronted Otto: silence or testimony, concealment or revelation, comfortable lies or unbearable truths. Father Kozlov chose silence, hiding the confession beneath the church floorboards where it remained for 47 years. The priest carried Otto's secret through the end of the war, through Stalin's persecutions, through decades of Soviet atheism that made religious service dangerous, through his own death in 1990. The confession was discovered in 1991 by Father Kozlov's successor, Father Pavel Volkov, during renovation of the church that had been returned to religious use after the Soviet Union's collapse. Father Volkov read Otto's words, understood their historical significance, made the decision that his predecessor could not, to make the confession public. Otto's letter shows us the banality of evil in its most naked form, wrote Dr. Yelena Bonner, the Russian historian who first analyzed the confession. It reveals how ordinary people become perpetrators not through ideology or hatred, but through the simple desire to belong, to avoid standing apart, to find humor in situations that should inspire only horror. The confession was authenticated through handwriting analysis, cross-referenced with military records, verified against survivor accounts from Belarus. Every detail checked out. The 7th Infantry Division had operated in the region. Villages had been burned. Civilians had been executed. The systematic cruelty Otto described matched patterns documented throughout Nazi-occupied territory. Otto's family was contacted and informed about his confession. His sister, Maria, was 73 years old when she learned the truth about her brother's wartime service. She read his words in her home in Rothenburg, surrounded by photographs of the gentle boy who had carved toys and played accordion and helped distribute food to the poor. "I knew something had broken Otto during the war," Maria told Dr. Bonner during their only interview. "He stopped writing letters home after 1942. Mother would cry at night, worried about her son's silence. When we received notice of his death, she said she was almost relieved because at least his suffering was over. Now I understand what he was suffering from. The reaction to Otto's published confession was immediate and polarized. German veterans groups condemned it as Soviet propaganda designed to shame Wehrmacht service. Holocaust scholars praised it as crucial evidence of how genocide was implemented by ordinary soldiers who found cruelty entertaining rather than burdensome. But the most powerful response came from an unexpected source. In 1994, Anna Petrova, a 70-year-old woman living in Minsk, read about Otto's confession in a Russian newspaper. Anna had been 12 years old in 1942, had witnessed the massacre in Krasnoy, had hidden behind her house watching German soldiers torture and murder her grandparents. "I remember the laughter," Anna told reporters during her only public statement about the incident. "I remember German voices laughing while my grandmother bled in the mud, while my grandfather crawled and barked like a dog. I remember thinking that these soldiers must be devils, because only devils could find such suffering funny." Anna's testimony confirmed every detail in Otto's confession, validated his memory, proved that the laughter had been real and the suffering genuine. A 12-year-old girl's nightmare matched exactly with a 25-year-old soldier's confession, separated by 52 years but united by shared witness to the same atrocity. Otto's confession does not make him a hero, Anna said, but it makes him honest. He admitted what he did, acknowledged that it was wrong, chose shame over silence. That matters somehow. It means the 17 who died are remembered not just as victims but as human beings whose suffering was witnessed and recorded and confessed. Otto's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about humor, cruelty, and the human capacity to find amusement in other people's pain. How many atrocities begin with laughter? How many genocides are implemented by people who genuinely find suffering entertaining? How many war crimes are committed by soldiers who enjoy their work? The village of Krasnoy no longer exists. Soviet authorities relocated the surviving population after the war, demolished the remaining buildings, planted forests where homes had stood. Today, birch trees grow where 17 elderly civilians were tortured and murdered for the entertainment of young men who had forgotten how to see suffering as anything other than comedy. But memory persists where buildings have disappeared. Anna Petrova has organized annual memorial services at the site, attended by survivors' descendants and anyone willing to listen to stories about ordinary evil. Otto's confession is read aloud each year, not to praise his honesty but to preserve the memory of what laughter can hide. The services draw visitors from across Europe, historians studying genocide, students learning about moral responsibility, veterans wrestling with their own memories of choices that transformed them into people they could no longer recognize. The readings of Otto's confession are followed by long silences, moments when audiences absorb the weight of what they have heard. Some visitors come seeking easy lessons about good and evil, clear distinctions between perpetrators and victims, simple answers to complex moral questions. They leave with harder questions about their own capacity for cruelty, their own willingness to laugh at suffering, their own ability to choose conscience over conformity when the price of standing apart becomes uncomfortable. The psychological research inspired by Otto's confession has revealed disturbing truths about human nature. Laboratory experiments show that ordinary people will laugh at others' suffering when placed in groups that normalize cruelty, that humor can be used to distance observers from victims' pain, that shared laughter creates bonds between perpetrators stronger than shared ideology. Otto's confession teaches us that evil is not something that happens to people but something people choose, laugh by laugh, silence by silence, moment by moment. It shows us that the most dangerous perpetrators are not sadistic monsters but ordinary individuals who learn to find cruelty entertaining, who discover that suffering can be funny when they are not the ones suffering. Subscribe so these forbidden stories never vanish again. The Bundesarchiv in Berlin houses Otto's original confession in file 12847V, available to researchers who request access through official channels. The Gothic script has faded to brown, the paper has become brittle with age, but the words remain clear, preserved behind glass that protects them from time while ensuring they can still be read. Visitors pause before the display case, reading Otto's confession through bulletproof glass, trying to understand how laughter could lead to murder, how entertainment could become genocide, how ordinary young men could find amusement in elderly people's degradation and death. Children on school trips ask their teachers whether Otto was evil or just weak, whether his confession makes him better or worse than soldiers who never admitted their crimes, whether they would have acted differently in his place. The teachers struggle to explain that evil and weakness often coexist, that confession without prevention is incomplete, that moral courage requires action rather than just acknowledgement. The most frequent question visitors ask is also the most disturbing. Would I have laughed too? The honest answer is that most people probably would have, that the psychological mechanisms that transformed Otto into a witness to atrocity operate on nearly everyone, that very few individuals possess the moral strength to stand apart when standing apart means isolation from the group. Otto's confession reminds us that genocide is not implemented by monsters but by ordinary people who learn to find cruelty entertaining, who discover that suffering can be amusing when properly framed, who choose laughter over conscience because laughter feels safer than moral isolation. The laughter that echoed through Krasnoy's village square on September 23, 1942, was not the laughter of devils but the laughter of young men who had learned to see suffering as comedy, degradation as entertainment, murder as shared bonding experience. It was human laughter, which makes it infinitely more terrifying than any demonic howling. In the silence after Otto's final words, we can still hear the echo of that laughter, still feel the weight of choices that transform decent people into witnesses to atrocity. We can still ask ourselves the questions Otto died trying to answer. What would we find funny when surrounded by people who encourage cruelty? How much of our humanity would we sacrifice to avoid standing apart? At what point does shared laughter become shared guilt? Entertainment become evil? Silence become complicity? The village square in Krasnoy is now covered by birch forest, but sometimes hikers report hearing sounds that have no source, not threatening, not supernatural, just sad. Voices speaking in languages they cannot identify. Laughter that stops abruptly as if cut short by shame. Prayers that seem to rise from the earth itself. File 12847V remains open in the Bundesarchiv. Some confessions demand permanent witness. Some laughter echoes across generations. Some shame refuses to be buried beneath forests or time or the comfortable fiction that ordinary people are incapable of extraordinary evil. We laughed when the old begged for mercy. The laughter follows me to this final darkness. May their prayers be louder than our laughter, now and always.